Welcome, Patrick Bond. And for those of you who are not familiar with him, he is a distinguished professor of sociology, a political economist, who is a professor at the University of Johannesburg. And of course, he has written widely on a variety of topics, touching on economics, climate, political science. And today we're going to talk a bit about climate debt, climate reparations, and the climate justice debate more generally.
So thank you for having me into a debate where I think actually it would be not terribly controversial to introduce, instead of global north, global south, for Institute for Policy Studies purposes, a familiarity with the world systems perspective, which adds the semi-periphery, so the core, the metropole, the semi-periphery and the periphery. Therefore, I'm going to say that the big picture is global north, global south is passé when you're dealing especially with climate and with general geopolitical processes and economics, global value chains. We could go into nearly any sphere in which the multilateral scene has been, let's say, co-opting the layer in the middle and largely, not entirely, but largely succeeding in assimilation. And therefore, I don't say there's an imperialist West and the rest, but rather that the imperialist West has a sub-imperial alliance with very important countries in the middle income, emerging economies, and then, of course, a vast periphery. And extreme super exploitative processes occur in this middle layer. So the sub-imperial layer, which you'd normally sort of say, oh, you mean Israel, you mean Saudi Arabia, of course. Those are the most obvious and durable. In the 1970s here in white South Africa, sub-imperialism worked very well, and plenty of other sites. The debate now I think we should be having is whether in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, especially after the 2009 Copenhagen summit, in which Barack Obama parachuted in and found the basic, that is Brazil, South Africa, India, China, leaders meeting in a special little green room, special room. And he barged in with Hillary Clinton and Todd Stern, and they did a deal. And I think at that point, we can very confidently say that the imperial powers and a sub-imperial climate layer for global policy and local practices emerged and has been decisive. Maybe the highest point of power was in 2015 at the Paris Climate Agreement to get rid of the climate debt. Just evaporate it, erase it, to say, if you sign, you agree, no liabilities, no compensation. And I think that would be the most crucial question to ask all of our dear comrades and friends who are doing advocacy, especially in our own African Union, where we have an African Union set of delegates, the African Negotiating Forum, who regularly go to the COPs and then are regularly disappointed by, of course, the South African, who the last 8 years has been white, upper middle class, and totally committed to ongoing emissions and never admitting a climate debt.
Mm. Well, at this most recent COP, I mean, perhaps even the most disappointing results, and you've written about some of the failures, especially to kind of confront fossil fuel companies, to address the critical issues of both imperial and sub-imperial powers that are committed to this kind of extractivist project. And you've pointed out in interesting ways, I think, that the United States and Russia might be at loggerheads, in multiple ways, but they have a common kind of commitment to fossil fuel extraction, to ensuring that we do not keep fossil fuels in the ground. So can you explain what has shifted, if anything, in the last, say, year or two leading up to most recent COP?
Well, here in Johannesburg, John, we probably would make an argument that something did shift, and that, yes, the Russian, the Chinese, and massive emitters. Add India. There's a new BRICS member, Indonesia, as of a year ago, and we could, toss in others that come from a very fossil-addicted economy. South Africa is the third highest in emissions per person per unit of output among countries with 10 million people or more. Just Kazakhstan, now a BRICS partner, and the Czech Republic are higher. Countries like UAE, a new BRICS member from 2023, and Egypt and Iran. And when we look at all of these BRICS and their interest, it's not the same anymore as Donald Trump, for the reason that they've bought into climate managerial politics in the UNFCCC, which typically allies the G7, but now, let's be clear, the G6 with the BRICS and other high-polluting emerging economies. Now, the G1, it did not come here to our G20 meeting in Johannesburg. It was a boycott, and it was a delegitimization effort by Trump and by especially Marco Rubio. And they used arguments that, oh, we're not going to come to a place where white people suffer genocide. Now, I can just tell you as white and having lived in Johannesburg since 1990, there's no sign. And in fact, most white people have gotten much better off since 1990. The historic wealth from a crime against humanity, apartheid now amplifies, and inequality is worse. And this is the most unequal city in the world. One reason is this is also the most criminal city for corporate behavior, according to PwC. So they're very corrupt. I trust them to measure economic crime and fraud. Their survey, and Joburg ranks number one typically. But setting that aside, what I find extraordinary is that the climate denialism of Donald Trump is not something that you find in the BRICS. Certainly China has got one of the most outwardly progressive sets of rhetoric about, and some extraordinary accomplishments in moving to renewable energy. But the ongoing use of fossil fuels means three things, I think, unite the G6. Again, Trump is out. He walked out first in 2017, then January 2025. So the G1 isn't here, but the G1's climate denialists. The G6 and the BRICS are not. But what they are committed to, I'm convinced, is first, not cutting the emissions fast enough to save the planet, not leaving fossil fuels underground. Number two, never acknowledging liability, climate debt. And number three, instead of emitting less and instead of, paying their due debt, then they are privatizing the air, we like to say. That is, they're taking the air, selling the right to pollute through carbon markets, emissions trading, offsets, and various gimmicks that are absolutely chaotic. Praful Bidwai, who was a Transnational Institute fellow, he described in 2009 in this phrase, hiding behind the poor. And that's the phrase he used against the Congress government in his native India. And Praful's argument about hiding behind the poor goes to the BRICS. They agree with the same three basic principles. Don't cut emissions enough. Don't admit you emitted, and privatize the air. And all of the BRICS have been, in one way or another, either hosting climate, projects of a sort of clean development mechanism, or reducing emissions through deforestation and forest degradation, all of the little gimmicks of offsets and carbon markets, or they're starting their own. But none of them are putting on a particularly high carbon price, price polluting. Just to quickly illustrate, China's had a market mostly in its big municipalities, its metros, and now national. But it hasn't risen above $12 per ton. And the South African price is 30 US cents per ton if I want to emit through my electricity company, Eskom, or through Sasol, the major petrochem company. That's all it costs. Now you compare that with the EU, the emissions trading scheme, which is running probably today around $90 a ton. I'll have to check it, somewhere around there. It was up as high as $115 a ton in February 2024. It crashed February 2023 to February 2024, to be precise. It crashed by 50%. So it's chaotic. But what should it be? And that becomes a crucial question when we are attempting to assess the climate debt and to dissuade major fossil projects. And the answer to that question, I think, comes from two economists from Northwestern and Stanford, Bilal and Kenzig, who in the National Bureau of Economic Research, a very conservative mainstream institution, a network of economists. And in their current working paper, their September 2025 social cost of carbon, right, the damage done, is $1,584 a ton. And you compare that to Barack Obama, who put it at 51, and Trump put it down to 1, and is now just ignoring this entirely. And I think Biden's EPA said, no, it should be 187, something in that range. And so we're very, very far short in our regulatory commitments to saying, what is the damage done? Can we internalize the externality? And I think it's very useful for us to be having a debate about a climate debt and then working with the International Court of Justice advisory opinion and seeing how that can be made juridical and, made into something that has some teeth. And the two big projects in this country, in South Africa, involve trying to prevent Shell, Total, and their allies locally from offshore oil and gas drilling, where we're in the top court, constitutional court, as we speak, probably going to win on grounds that may have to do with climate, but are also about the damage to local ecologies and spiritual life that Shell, Total, and their local friends that Impact Africa will be doing. And secondly, we're debating whether coal mine should be expanding, given that its scope 3 emissions, the emissions that will come from burning the coal, will have a devastating effect.
Well, that's very useful. This is, of course, where the rubber literally hits the road, the assessments of the social costs of carbon. I want to dig down into two other mechanisms that you've talked about. One is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, that the European Union has put into place in order to prevent the leakage of carbon, to ensure that the European Union isn't simply kind of exporting pollution to other countries and then re-importing it embedded in products that are now produced outside of the European Union. Let's start with that one, and then we'll go to the polluter pay principle, which I think is also a very key kind of element of your approach. Let's start with CBAM. Yeah, because you pointed out some errors with that approach that Europe has, but it seems, be improved and applied.
Indeed. I think, John, the way I'd add to CBAM an accompanying policy, mostly from Europe and the UK, it was also from the US, it's called JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership. To me, John, we look at them together as a carrot, the JETP, and a stick, like a cartoon, bam, the CBAM hits you hard with the stick, except it doesn't. So very quickly, the flaws. CBAM is what started January 1, which is it's the beginning of a tax at the border, one that is now being also discussed for the U.S. to deter Trump from invading Greenland, along with a few other small, little pricks on U.S.-European trade. But this one is extraordinarily important if, as you say, we want to stop the outsourcing of emissions. That is, when a company in Europe sends its dirty industries to the south or to the emerging markets. Certainly, South Africa will be among the hardest hit. I think we rank number 10 of the countries that export to Europe, and the most important this year are steel and aluminum, and those have very intensive CO2 emissions embedded within them, very carbon-intensive activities because of the coal-fired power plants that, for the laptop I'm running, talking to you from, it's 82% of the power. But now that heavy carbon intensity means that we will probably start losing more jobs in these crucial metal sectors. We've been losing jobs all year, creating a terrible decline in industry in the last year. So that's Trump, but the ripple effect of Trump from the Chinese overproduction and inability to use. They basically lost 20% of their market, so they're putting it elsewhere. Now, the whole point of that is that the CBAM will reduce even further the international demand for South African steel and aluminium. That the depletion of the natural resource has a cost, which is never incorporated, the natural capital depletion. And so this concessional loan, 97% its loans, it's up to now $12.5 billion. So it's a big fund. Should allow us to close down our coal-fired power plants early. And to the extent we need to import, turbines for wind or solar panels and batteries and inverters, then we can make that transition. But the basic question, can you combine a carrot and a stick in the way that Europe is suggesting, the stick being CBAM? Now, two caveats. CBAM allows the term green energy to include methane gas. What the hell? Methane gas is 85 times more potent than CO2 emissions. So some just sleazy European Brussels deal makers put that in nuclear as well. And also they are still refusing to acknowledge climate debt. Instead of using the revenues from the CBAM, they could easily distribute them. Instead of doing so, they are, obviously just using them for their own internal needs in Europe. And that means more, militarization, I think. They can have to fend off the Yankees in Greenland. I can't blame them for that. And fending off Russia, can't blame them for that. But it's really tragic that means the funding isn't really going to go where it should from historic European emissions. For the Jet P, as I said, the flaws are profound. The debt, the tide aid. I mean, a whole bunch of the money at the moment seems to be going to the consultancies. I mean, the consultancies, these big KPMGs and Ernst & Youngs and SAPs, all the kind of big boys that do this sort of work instead of going to local environmental justice groups. And I think in those ways, I would say, look, we do need a Jet P. We need an incentive. South Africa should pay some climate debt. I mean, I should, right? We should be figuring out what a Jet P, how you pay to leave the oil in the soil and the coal in the hole. The third is a project to try to compensate people for climate debt. If the polluter should pay, John, I should pay. So who should I pay? Well, I'd like to pay, thank you, environmental justice groups, for all the local work you do and for your climate advocacy. That would be, to me, one way to make sure that funding that is owed to people goes to a very hard-hitting response. But we also have so many cases like the one we're seeing about 300 kilometers east of here in Mpumalanga and Limpopo, drownings because of terrible flooding underway, Mozambique underwater. We owe them so much. Hundreds probably dying. We saw thousands die in the 2019 cyclones. You see, the Mozambique Channel is just heating up 30 degrees centigrade. And so these extreme weather events are becoming more and more common. So I think there is a model for how you would get money, just cash, to people who urgently need to be able to go into local markets, be able to, rent somewhere safe that's above the water levels, basically pay for surviving. And that project was called the Ochevero Namibia Basic Income Grant, where everyone, the old grannies, their grandchildren, many of the middle layer were off in the cities. So this little village about an hour to the east of the capital, Windhoek, was able to get from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Germany, with IG Metall, the main trade union, giving support, about 10 euros per person per month for a few years when they were running a pilot. And that to me was the sort of solidaristic example, people to people, through institutions of civil society, that I felt might be the kind of model to do a climate debt payment. And to me, those are the sorts of things that are so much more superior than the so-called multipolar world in which the BRICS in reality are part of the West.
Yeah. Well, I'm encouraged by this solidaristic approach. We started up a campaign here in Western Mass to raise money to fund a clean energy project in Ecuador. And so it's basically just a community-to-community payment of climate debt, which could serve as a model for other types of communities in the global north, pairing off, much as we had sister city relationships during the Cold War, to kind of break down the barriers, to avoid some of the pitfalls of international finance and banks making a profit from these kinds of financing arrangements, and just kind of doing it on a community by community basis.
But in fact, at IPS, Michael Schumann was doing exactly that sister city work when I was there in the late 80s. So I do encourage Michael, if you're listening, we can get in touch with him to reapply those same principles.
His concepts of municipal foreign policy were very powerful. And I think, especially at a time when here in the United States, our federal government is obviously not going to be doing anything good for the next 3 years, building up that capacity at a municipal level, I think is going to be absolutely critical. One of the challenges, and you've pointed this out on a number of occasions, is that when we talk about a transition, an energy transition, it's often the global north, figuring out ways, especially in Europe, not so much here in the United States, though, again, at a state level, less so at a federal level at the moment, figuring out ways of making an energy transition, of moving away from fossil fuels, relying more on solar, on wind, etc. But of course, that energy transition relies on energy or mineral inputs from the global south. And so you see that the energy transition of the north, and again, I'm speaking in the broadest terms of global north and global south here, but the energy transition of the wealthier countries depends a great deal on the extraction of resources from the south. How do you conceptualize a move away from that? I mean, I really appreciate this kind of carrot and stick of the jet Ps and the CBAMs, but this breaking away from this extraction of not just the fossil fuels, of keeping the oil in the ground, keeping the coal in the ground, but we've moved on to a much broader extractivist model, taking lithium out of the ground, cobalt out of the ground, rare earth elements out of the ground in order to produce the manufactured goods that are so essential to this energy transition. So how do we apply that kind of perspective to this other set of extraction projects?
Some of that extremely destructive extractive industry work on the new energy economy, such as lithium, can possibly be leapfrogged. And so I'll just quickly mention, I've spent a bit of time at the largest lithium mine in Africa recently. It's called Bakita. It's in Zimbabwe, right in the center of the country. And my colleague there, Farai Maguwu, he runs the Center for Natural Resource Governance, alerted the whole country with his tweets that we're getting ripped off, guys, because we were promised there'd be a battery factory here. The raw lithium would be processed, but it's in fact just being carted out. The huge trucks, flatbed trucks with bags and bags of this raw lithium go out and they wreck the road. And so this led us to start thinking about two potential substitutes. And one of them, in especially South Africa, has been very effective. It's the pumped storage way of storing energy that you could produce during the day with your solar. When it's a sunny day, it's windy outside. But when at night there's no sun or the wind goes down, then you need to have some heavy force, and water is easiest. You pump it up during the day when energy is there, excess energy in the period, not, sort of during the heavy morning and afternoon peaks. And then at night, you let it come down through turbines, and you have two small reservoirs. You're not talking about mega dams, but relatively sympathetic to the environments of mountainous areas. So we have two of those plants. They're called Ingula and Steenbras, and they have been extraordinarily effective in that, let's say, replacing the coal and we have a tiny bit of nuclear with clean energy that is stored, and so we don't waste it. Now that's the optimal, isn't it, to find sites, and I'm thinking my own underneath me, 200 Ks from here, in circumference, half the world's gold. Well, it's all gone. Our city's falling apart. But we still have very deep mines, and we could even put these pumped storage with rocks, just in the mine, up and down, using the gravity to create the energy during the night, but pump it, bring the heavy objects to the surface. But certainly lithium in Zimbabwe, and of course it's in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we're seeing some lithium along our coastline. And they, right now it looks very much like a smash and grab and a source of resource cursing and the depletion of the non-renewable resource. So it may be that we will be making arguments to leave the lithium underground and move more quickly. In other cases, it'll be more difficult. So one of the most exciting of the sort of new uses of especially platinum, whose price has just been soaring, partly because of the supply constraints. We have 85% of the world's platinum. But if you make a platinum, specifically rhodium and palladium battery cell for green hydrogen, and it's genuine green hydrogen. It's not gray hydrogen. It's not, it actually is generated through ecologically sensitive splitting of hydrogen from oxygen from whatever body of water is available. They're probably going to do it in a very ineffectual way on the coast of South Africa and wrecking the local fishing grounds and ocean with brine. But nevertheless, platinum may be one of those. And I think the most crucial thing, and thinking through what is the new economy's requirements. What does Donald Trump want when he's talking about rare earth minerals coming out of the Eastern DRC? $4 trillion, in his view, should come out through Lobito, that's on the Angolan coastline, instead of going on the Chinese rail line, which is from Zambia to Tanzania, the Tanzam Railroad from the 1960s. So I think the crucial question to ask is, what do future generations want from all of these non-renewable resources? If you are taking these natural resources out of the ground, and it's multinational mining corporates, and you're taking way too much, way too fast, you put all that together and you say, well, actually, the case to leave some of that in the ground for next generations is strong. And women against mining really here in Johannesburg, plus Acción Ecológica in Quito in Ecuador, they're making these arguments all sorts of ways that are feminist and spiritual and powerful. I think we can add, in a sympathetic way, the argument that if you take Brundtland seriously, then the future generations' rights to have these minerals. And I'm going to even add, this is very controversial, that we should leave fossil fuels underground, because the lubricants and the synthetic materials, my laptop got lots of plastics, the tarmac, the pharmaceutical products, these are coming from hydrocarbons. And if we're burning the hydrocarbons now and creating greenhouse gases and wrecking future generations, we're simultaneously denying easy to access hydrocarbons. So I think that's yet another argument that we should be deploying as we think not just geographically and in terms of our current generation's interests, but future generations. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, that's very helpful. I want to ask one last question as we get up towards the hour mark. And that's, we're coming up on another Davos meeting, another World Economic Forum meeting. And of course, Donald Trump is expected to loom large in these conversations. And indeed, climate change in general, climate issues are barely present, or expected to be barely present at this meeting. I mean, I read one comparison that back in 2022, there were 16 sessions that referenced climate change in some way. And in this upcoming meeting, there are only 4. And who knows even if at those 4 conversations, they'll really address it in any serious way. And, one of the kind of highlight conversations will be between our energy secretary, U.S. Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, and the head of Occidental Petroleum. And so that's going to be a kind of centerpiece conversation about, probably the centrality of oil, the continued centrality of oil and fossil fuels for energy production. So obviously there's been this major shift, and you've talked about how, the climate movement has been relatively quiescent, with the exception of some key movements, key civil society organizations that are continuing the fight in different parts of the world. But given this kind of shift that we're seeing even at Davos among the wealthy, what expectation do you have that anything, any levers that we have in the climate justice movement that we can apply at this given period of time, given the abandonment even of the liberal elite of their approach to climate issues?
Well, it's such a great question, John, that can have us drinking beer all night to figure it out. The answer is so indeterminate because of how many forces are in the international progressive community. And I think Davos could be important for making that a very, let's say, vulnerable situation for U.S. neocon and a little bit of paleocon sort of arrogance. Unfortunately, it means going back to the rules of the road, and that means hoping that Keir Starmer and some Danes and Norwegians, some Germans and French, Spaniards will stick up for the Greenlanders, 56,000, who really deserve some form of independence. And this may slow them down, may speed it up, I'm not sure. And I think Davos could be the place where more of these contradictions appear. What with global corporates, what I can see from the program is a serious attention to artificial intelligence and its foibles, because there is a triple crash of, number one, as they say, the AI bubble on Wall Street and the other stock markets. Number two, a crypto crash, because they've invested so much in this ether-based money, and that never turns out well. And number three, a debt crash, and there are debt crises all over. We're going to be hearing of all kinds of other techniques, the way Davos generates ideas, vision. I think we'd all have to agree, delegitimization of Davos is still crucial. And South Africa goes there begging and hoping that things like taking Israel to the International Court of Justice on Genocide, a very good move back 2 years ago, hopefully it results in a judgment sooner than later, even while we're the number one, in fact, the only supplier of coal that is energy to the two big coal-fired power plants that fuel the genocide and provide the power for the IDF to control the West Bank and Gaza. Now, that means we've got very few champions. Bavu Petro in Davos, So I think the sooner this week is over, the better, unless it has the effect of further isolating Donald Trump. When you hear Europeans start talking sanctions against the US, BDS, when we know that they've done that against Elon Musk, who had his worst years, 2 high school years here in Johannesburg, where he was bullied, smart little kid becomes a monster here. And when you've got his grok being possibly banned in X.com being banned in the UK. Then we're moving in a way that I think could bring internationalism into a sanctions debate that unfortunately has been, kind of ruined. We have great BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions movements against Israel and against fossil fuels and against Myanmar, the Burmese military junta. But we need to now say, okay, well, how do we really find weak points the way the Chinese did when they said no more rare earth minerals for you, Donald Trump?
Yes. Well, that's a good perspective. I know I said that was the last question, but I want to just throw in one real quick one. And that is, you did mention kind of the multipolarist approach. And I'm curious why you think the multipolarists have fallen down on climate issues. I mean, it just doesn't seem to be part of their agenda. I mean, they are not skeptical about Russian motives and not skeptical about Chinese motives or Iranian motives. They prioritize kind of the delegitimization of the primary empire, the U.S. empire. But climate doesn't seem to enter their calculations. And I'm curious why you think that has fallen from their presumably left perspective.
But what I fear is that at some point, a lot of the multipolarists who especially support the BRICS and think that, Russia's anti-imperialist and China is socialist, and here in South Africa that these coal jobs are needed, and we obviously can't replace the coal jobs. That would be their argument. All of these big unions, and 150 to 300,000 members each, the biggest, and they are now, once eco-socialist in their ideology 15 years ago, have now said, no, we're going to keep the coal-fired power plants open as long as we can. Let's keep digging and exporting the coal. So I'd say part of what our problem is, John, is we did a terrible job in the climate justice movement after 2010, because I think at the peak of our movement, which was in Cochabamba, Bolivia, where Pablo Solon, Evo Morales pulled together 35,000 people. We failed, and it may have been, I think we allowed too many reformist reforms in that UNFCCC, and therefore like a Paris climate agreement saying, we forgive climate debt. So to me, that would be a strategic mistake instead of finding other sites. What other sites? Well, there are potential, movement solidarity moments. So we've been working Total Energies and trying to get them out of Uganda and Tanzania and northern Mozambique with the fossil fuels and big coordinated protests against Total, hitting their shareholders, hitting their directors. That would be corporate campaigning. Legal campaigning may have some potential now with the ICJ case. There are lots of other ways to go and to rebuild a CJ philosophy, frankly, because our climate action, and I'll be also frank, our multipolar advocacy, where the global south includes the likes of China, South Africa, massive polluters who do enormous damage in these meetings. So finding a lot more punchy ways to raise climate as climate is punching us right now. This terrible set of storms going on just to the east of me, coming on here in Johannesburg, and we certainly do not have our city climate prepared. We don't have resilience and adaptation really anywhere in Southern Africa that I know of. And so we've got to really raise it as a massive eco-socialist challenge.
Patrick Bond, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we could have talked for another hour, or perhaps, as you say, overnight on many of these issues. And I look forward to having another conversation with you in the next couple of months.